I'm going to talk about the issues involved in planning a review when including qualitative evidence. And first of all, just to declare my interests in this topic. So I'm a co-convener of the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods groups. And like lots of other presenters today, I've received funding to do systematic reviews and methodological research over the past 20 years. I also conduct primary qualitative research and randomised controlled trials on social interventions in health, which I hope are eventually included in systematic reviews. So just before I get into the issue of protocols and pre-specification when it comes to qualitative evidence, I wanted to be clear about what qualitative evidence is and what it can do, particularly in relation to diversity, which was one of the themes of the Santiago colloquium. So when I'm talking about qualitative evidence, usually that's produced from research which uses both qualitative methods to collect data and qualitative methods to analyse the data. So we may also be sometimes drawing on qualitative data which has come from, for example, a survey of people's opinions and attitudes. But what qualitative evidence can do, and the reason why we want to review it in a systematic way and bring it to bear in the evidence base around interventions to promote health, is it provides qualitative research and evidence synthesis provides an opportunity for diverse views to be heard in terms of how people experience a particular health condition, but also in terms of the process of intervention. How do people experience an intervention, and what can that tell us about how that worked for them, and what factors influence the implementation of an intervention? If it is found to be effective, what are the issues in terms of then rolling it out in the real world? Qualitative research can also pick up on any harmful or unintended consequences in terms of intervention implementation, and it can also look at the impact of context in terms of how well an intervention works or not. So when we're talking about qualitative evidence synthesis, we're talking about the process by which individual studies, mainly addressing issues of context, process and experience, are identified, brought together and combined into a whole to produce new or enhanced understanding. So in terms of what our protocol is for and why we pre-specify how we're going to do the review, it's about really thinking about how can we ensure that when we do produce our new or enhanced understanding, that is a rigorous new enhanced understanding. So I'm going to be drawing on chapter 21 in the handbook, written by my co-conveners of the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods group, listed here on this slide. And I think at least two conveners are on the webinar as well. So I'm going to be giving a very broad brush overview of the kinds of issues that qualitative evidence throws up in terms of thinking about planning a review. And I'd recommend really that there's lots more detail in our chapter, and a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today you can find references to them in this chapter. So I've listed here and on the next slide the broad areas of planning in a review, any review, and looked at it in terms of what are the planning tools that are available for qualitative evidence synthesis. And just to give a flavour of some of the examples of the issues or the dilemmas that are thrown up at each particular stage in terms of pre-specification. I think one of the things to note about this slide and the next slide that I'm going to present is, even though qualitative evidence synthesis is newer than conventional reviews of effectiveness, we do still have we have got quite well established tools for helping us to think through some of the issues. So in terms of question development and review scope, I've mentioned two tools here: the retreat framework and perspective, which is a expansion of the PICO framework that we've just been hearing about. So the retreat framework helps us to think about broadly what how we're going to plan the review. It helps us to think about the resources that are going to be used, what kind of expertise you need in the team, advisory groups, and so on. And then when it comes to thinking about question development, this perspective gives a really useful guide to how we might specify questions for qualitative evidence synthesis. So just taking an example of a review that I've recently been involved with, in terms of the per aspect of perspective, we're thinking there about whose perspective. So qualitative research is really, really useful for looking at people's perspectives and experiences. And so in the review that I was involved in, we were focusing on pregnant women in a setting from an urban environment. And the phenomenon we was interested in, we wanted to know women's perspectives and experiences about group antenatal care. So that's the P in the perspective, the phenomenon of interest. Then we might also want to specify the environment that the group, in this case, group antenatal care is set in. So is that in a high income context, for example, or a low income context? You may also want to specify the comparison group, the C in perspective. In our case, it was standard care. Timing, for example, we wanted to know about their experiences of antenatal care right up to their delivery. And then in terms of findings, our focus on the findings was how can women's perspectives and experiences of this novel method of antenatal care, how can that help us to think about how the intervention might possibly work, and then to link that to an existing effectiveness review, which looks at the effectiveness of group antenatal care for pregnant women. So some of the dilemmas this raises for thinking about qualitative evidence synthesis is that quite often within qualitative research, concepts are less well pre-specified, and the aim is to keep a broader focus, because there might be unanticipated avenues. By narrowing down too soon, you would lose that ability to explore the unexpected. So perspective is a really useful tool for helping us to think through the parameters of the review, but it really depends on what the purpose of your review. So if your review is more exploratory in terms of concepts, then you might want to not populate all of the different aspects of perspective. So in terms of searching for studies, there's a particular framework which we go into a bit more detail about in the handbook, but what I really wanted to raise here in terms of pre-specification, in terms of sources for searching, is that qualitative research can be hidden. Like randomized controlled trials, it's taken many years to put into place things like writing titles with randomized controlled trials in it. So qualitative research is a little bit behind in terms of making sure that consistent terminology is used. There's also other reasons why qualitative research might be hidden, and if you stick to looking at conventional databases that you might not find. So particularly in terms of thinking about a local context and being able to search the grey literature and get local for example, government reports, which might have collected, or from charities, community organisations that might have looked at the views of particular populations. And when we are looking at perspectives, we do want to make sure that our syntheses are reflective of those diverse perspectives. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, just to talk about some of the later stages of the review before I run out of time. So in terms of methods of synthesis, so our handbook chapter recommends 3 different types of syntheses. The kind of traffic light criteria. So thematic synthesis at the moment is considered to be a very flexible method of synthesis. It allows you to synthesize a wide range of different types of qualitative research, whereas you might be a bit more restrictive with a meta-ethnography. Some of the dilemmas that raises at the moment is in terms of the types of methods we're able to consider within Cochrane review. So currently we're not recommended realist approaches or more interpretive methods, which are those methods which are less likely to pre-specify how they might do things. Then another issue to think about in planning the review is the extent to which you're going to integrate the qualitative evidence synthesis with either an existing review, or whether you're going to conduct your qualitative research review alongside an effectiveness review. And there are various tools to enable you to do this. So we've reviewed some of those in our handbook. So things like using a matrix to look at the differences in the findings between the trials and the qualitative research. And in this situation, the qualitative research can actually uncover some hidden bias within the trials research. So quite often we're looking for whether interventions included in the intervention review have actually considered the perspectives of the intended recipient of the intervention. And quite often what it reveals is that a trialist world is worlds apart from the user world, and they've rarely met in the middle. So we find that things that are important to users or the recipients of interventions have not yet been tested in interventions. So just to conclude, so we do have well-developed and tested planning tools which we can use for qualitative evidence synthesis. So certainly, speaking on behalf of my conveners, I think I'm right in saying that we welcome the ability to write protocols, plan reviews, and pre-specify some of the things that we're going to do in the reviews, whilst remaining open to being able to change that, but also being transparent when we do have to change what we typically propose we would do. And I think in terms of the overall question for this session, I think these form the basis for refining the current standards in the reporting and review protocols, certainly for qualitative synthesis. And I think one of the things we need to do as a group is to look at how well we're doing in terms of writing protocols. It's still early days, not in terms of the establishment of qualitative evidence synthesis, but in terms of seeing reviews coming through into the Cochrane library. And we're all still in this process of learning what kind of guidance people need to be able to write really good protocols.